Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This issue of holding the opposition to account for failing to implement the democratic reforms designed to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections is an important debate. And to me, it is the way forward. We have got to agree that as long as Zanu PF is able to rig the elections, the regime will remain in power. In my humble opinion, there are two options of stopping Zanu PF remaining in power. The first option is that we took up arms because this regime is determined to remain in power. And as long as it's able to rig the elections, it will stay in power. And the issue of taking up arms is absolutely unnecessary as far as I'm concerned. To start with, we did take up arms. We did end white colonial rule by taking up arms. Did that deliver freedom, liberty, justice for all, and economic opportunities for all? The answer is no. You don't have to look at Zanu PF. One of the options, one of the realities that that option should have been ruled out even then was we have got to ask ourselves, if we take up arms, what kind of leader will the armed struggle throw up? And in our case, we've got the answer. Our armed struggle threw up the kind of leaders we don't want. We've been stuck with Zanu PF because they believe they fought the war of independence and they deserve the right to rule. Another armed struggle will throw up same kind of leadership. In any case, why would you want to take up arms when you can have the solution to the problem without having to shed any blood? How then are we going to end this Zanu PF dictatorship? Answer is simple. We should have opposition leaders who are going to commit themselves to implementing democratic reforms and stop the circus of rigged elections. That was what the nation's consensus was by the late 1990s. And the MDC, the Movement for Democratic Change, emerged as a party that said, we are going to deliver those changes. And they formed the party in 1999. And now, 24 years later, the honest truth is they failed to implement even one reform. The logical question to ask then is, well, if they failed, let's get somebody else who can. And this is what this debate is all about. It seems to me that some people are finding it a bridge too far. Asking the question that MDC leaders have failed to implement reforms. Even after 25 years, 24 years, we are not to ask that question. It's ridiculous. It's pathetic. Here is a comment from one of those individuals. I think we should address that question, the issues he's raised. I've got it on the screen there. Us who are so critical of the opposition, how do we respond to outsiders who label us as stupid fools for waiting these many years and counting for a solution to come from the same people we criticize? I think the simple answer to that one is yes, we have waited a long time. 24 years. I think we should have been more critical sooner. Some of us can say, well, we have been saying that MDC have failed to implement reforms for a number of years. It's just that we've got a nation that is very slow at thinking. But nonetheless, as a nation, we have been slow at criticizing the MDC for failing to implement reforms. Very slow indeed. And what makes that particularly more poignant is that we have been slow before. The question reminds me of Zimbabwe's Chimurenga minstrel, Dr. Thomas Mapfumo. In one of his songs, he asks that question. How long are we supposed to wait for the things that you promised us? The song itself, some people may remember it, is the sorry, let me just get the correct title. Beg your pardon. It's how many more years? Kwapera makore mangani, takamiri, zvamakavhimbisa. You promised us that you would deliver democratic change. And we have been waiting, and nothing has happened. How many more years should we wait for those things to happen? The song is based on the title Maiti kurima, hamubviri. You said you could deliver democratic change. You said you are capable of delivering. He, in his song, was addressing the Zanu PF leadership. You promised freedom, liberty, and yet we've waited for decades, and these things have not come. But I think we can ask the same question of the opposition leadership now. We have waited for you for 24 years to deliver democratic change. You promise you will deliver democratic change. And we've waited all these, these years for you to deliver that. Maiti hamubviri. Maiti kurima hamubviri. Maiti changes. You even named your own party to deliver those democratic change. This is the movement for democratic change. Well, after 24 years, what democratic changes have you delivered? I totally agree. We have been very slow to ask that question. And in the case of Zanu PF, I think we didn't ask that question until the late 1990s. By then, the regime was so deeply entrenched, it corrupted so many of the country's institutions. Removing it from office has been a challenge. One would have thought that would have learned the lesson from that mistake, so that this time we'll be quick off the mark, electing the opposition with the understanding that they would deliver democratic change. And we should be quick off the mark to ask them what is happening here. During the GNU, when the opposition had the golden chance to implement the reforms, they did not. And we should have been the ones asking them, why? What is the problem here? We did not. But I would still say, yes, it's late, but it's better late than never. We should ask those questions now with even greater agency. To keep on pretending that MDC did not have a chance to implement the reforms is naive, to say the very least. They did have the chance. They wasted it. I've got on the screen there another question from another commentator. Given the opportunity to meet Chamisa, what do you want him to do after his resignation, even though I know he has his numbers? What are you trying to do here? Changing people's mind will not work. Well, I dismiss that comment because it somehow suggests that the opposition did not implement any reforms because they never received any advice. They did receive advice. During the GNU, throughout the 5 years of the GNU, Sadak leaders, notably South Africa's Minister Lindiwe Zulu, pushed Moge Trangirai and his colleagues, nagged them to implement the reforms. They were ignored. Towards the end of the GNU, Sadak leaders realized that without reforms, Zimbabwe was just going to have a repeat of the 2008 elections. And they called a special meeting, a special summit, Sadak Summit, in Maputo, Mozambique, in June 2013. at which they told Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends to their faces, if you participate in these elections, you will lose. The elections are done. You need to postpone, don't participate in these elections until you've implemented the democratic reforms. That advice fell on deaf ears. Morgan Tsvangirai and company went on to participate in the elections. And as we know, Zanu PF blatantly rigged those. Why did they participate? Greed. They knew Zanu PF was rigging those elections. They knew participating would give Zanu PF legitimacy, but they also knew that Zanu PF would be giving away a few gravy train seats for those who participate. It is for the same reason, greed, that MDC leaders failed to implement even one democratic reform during the GNU. I think the great tragedy here is how some people refuse to accept historic facts for the sake of presenting the opposition as competent leaders. Indeed, some of them, they really want the opposition to be seen as infallible demigods who even somebody to question what they've done is almost sacrilege, totally being disrespectful. That is the kind of naivety that allowed Zanu PF to entrench itself. Because for the first 2 decades after independence in Zimbabwe, it was unthinkable to criticize Robert Mugabe. It's shocking that even at the time when the Kukura Wundi was in full swing, some people would still refuse to accept what it is happening. They wanted some other explanation. They did not want to admit the Zanu PF was launching this war of attrition for selfish political gain. It took them a long time to accept that political reality. It's taken already 24 years for some people to finally accept, as the results of last year's election clearly showed, that Zanu PF is still able to blatantly rig the elections. And that is only possible because no democratic reforms were implemented. That is the reality. We are going to go for the 2028 elections. And as things stand right now, one can see that the opposition is going to participate in those elections without any reforms. Chamisa is gearing to tell his supporters he will win those elections without reforms. How long are we going to keep on repeating the same foolishness over and over again? This is unbelievable. I think the challenge here is not so much Zanu PF, but that MDC Triple C leaders have become the enablers of Zanu PF. Zanu PF would have been history by now if MDC had implemented the democratic reforms. If MDC Triple C had stopped participating in these flawed elections to give Zanu PF legitimacy. That is the truth. And we must deal with it. And the only rational way of dealing with it is to accept that the opposition, as it's presently stands, will never implement any meaningful democratic change. They will participate in flawed elections to give Zanu PF legitimacy and thus perpetuate the dictatorship. Our task is to convince the naive and gullible Triple C supporters that they are their own worst enemies. Sadak, last elections, condemned those elections as flawed and illegal, but they did not deny Zanu PF political legitimacy because the people participated in numbers. People who voted for Chamisa alone, nearly 2 million. And as long as Zimbabweans are participating in their numbers in these flawed elections, the international community has got to accept that if the people themselves are happy with rigged elections, it is not for the outside world to tell us, no, you should not participate in rigged elections. That is what we are dealing with here. And it is really disappointing that we're not moving forward. 24 years of MDC Triple C. We cannot accept that they failed to implement reforms. That simple step, we cannot make that. It's a bridge too far. Why? And the suggestion that since we have not criticized them these last 24 years, well, we should not criticize them. It's ridiculous. We may have been slow at realizing that we're making a mistake, but now that we have realized that we're making a mistake, of course we must correct it. I've got a feeling that this is a debate that is going to drag on and on. Meanwhile, we are getting towards the elections, and before what we know what is happening, the elections are upon us, and the opposition will participate in those elections. And we are back to where we are today. That may well be the case, but nonetheless, I think the rational thing is that one must do their best to make sure that at least everybody out there this time they hear the warning that it is sheer madness to keep participating in an election process that is so flawed, that is so illegal, only to give Zanu PF, the vote rigging Zanu PF legitimacy and perpetuate one's own suffering. Because there's no doubt about it. As long as Zanu PF is in power, we are perpetuating our own suffering. As for EMDC, Chamisa and company, they are hell-bent on participating in these elections because they are after the few gravy train seats that Zanu PF offers. Some people are finding that hard to swallow, but that is the truth. Chamisa and company are not interested in delivering free, fair, and credible elections to Zimbabwe. They are interested in the share of the spoils of power. And they've come up with an arrangement with Zanu PF where they participate in these flawed elections, and in return, they get a few of the gravy train seats. That is the truth. Got a feeling that we are going to have a long battle on this issue. But so be it. We must not shy away from it. There are those who are absolutely hell-bent in silencing that debate. I think we have to resist them. Thomas Mapfumo was right. In asking the question, Kwapera makore mangani, takamiri zvamakavhimbisa. It's a beautiful song with a lot of meaning. But that song, right now, we need to play it to Chamisa and company. After 24 years of promising democratic changes, not even a token reform implemented, we have to ask, Kwapera makore mangani takamirira, ma reforms, ma changes, ma democratic changes, zvamakavhimbisa. This cannot go on. We need those reforms to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. And the idea that we can keep on waiting for Chamisa and company to bring about those changes is ridiculous. 24 years is a long time. If they had the democratic will, the political will to implement those reforms, they should have done it by now. They would have done it by now. Thank you very much for listening, and have a good evening. I hope we'll meet you tomorrow. 7 o'clock UK time and 8 o'clock Zimbabwe time. Thank you and good night.